We're here this morning. I'm David Sutton, and it's April 27th, 2018. And I'm here with Professor Richard Wilk, who is Professor Emeritus at Indiana University. And this is the first in a series of interviews for the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition that are looking at the development of the field of food anthropology. So Rick, maybe you could start off by reflecting for us a little bit about your relationship to food anthropology. I feel like you were becoming a food anthropologist at the same moment, historical moment, that the notion of a subfield of food anthropology itself was developing. And you also founded the first and only PhD program in the anthropology of food in the United States. So perhaps you could reflect a little bit on that convergence.
Sure. Um, for me, I think the topic of food was always on the table, so to speak, because my family was very food oriented and we traveled a lot and always placed an emphasis on eating local food and learning something about the culture and the place by with our mouths. And so when I started doing ethnography in Belize, one of the things that it really initially intrigued me about Belize was that there was no local food, and that when you asked for something local, people kind of shrugged their shoulders and acted uncomfortable, like I'd asked them for something that didn't exist. And most of my dissertation research, because it was in the tradition of cultural ecology, was more oriented towards production than it was towards consumption. But it was generally about food and how people produce food. But over time, what I was seeing more and more in the communities that I was working in was that people were selling corn and rice and other edibles to buy, among other things, canned tuna and mackerel and white flour. And I was early on introduced to the idea that white bread and white cake were particularly powerful foods that were infinitely superior to corn tortillas, which is, of course, what I wanted to eat. So food and cultural difference were connected pretty intimately in my field work. And with the Kekchi people I was working with, work was always associated with a group meal, with a feast, and food was at the center of every community gathering. Um, but there was no such thing as food anthropology at the time. And it wasn't until I went back in the 1990s to study consumer culture that I had the immense frustration of trying to get people to talk about national identity in food at uh, and and consumption at a time when um, people really didn't know how to talk about those things. And it turned out that the first Belizean restaurant opened while in Belize while I was doing that field work. And that and beauty pageants turned out to be the two places where people eventually felt very comfortable talking about what it meant to be a Belizean and how that related to an ethnic identity that was sub or supranational. Um, so I started writing initially about beauty pageants um, and found that there wasn't much of a community of scholars to speak to there. Just a bunch of evolutionary anthropologists and biologists who were trying to propose there were universal standards of beauty. but I found people were much more receptive when I was talking about food. Another important thing for me was to go to the Association for the Study of Food and Society meetings in the year 2000 because I found a community where the topic was much more important than the disciplines people were coming from. And the opportunity to have a conversation, a productive conversation with people from lots of other disciplines without kind of arguing about our methodology or our theoretical approaches, I found very refreshing. And when I came back to Indiana as a new department chair, um, charged with finding a focus for the future for the department, it turned out that food was a topic that united the whole department and included people in all four subfields. So it proved a very easy way of planning something ahead that was going to be innovative and that was going to involve most of our faculty.
So, when you think of yourself in relation to the field, um, I think of a lot of specialties. I think of the Caribbean. I think of consumption. I think of globalization. I think of everyday life. And I think of food. And it made me think, if I were drawing a Venn diagram with you and Sid Mintz and Danny Miller, there would be a lot of interesting overlaps there, including archaeology for two of you,
Yeah.
consumption, the Caribbean for all three of you.
Yeah.
So I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on the interrelation of these things in any way that you'd like to.
Mm. Well, I have to, in some way, involve your mother, um, Connie, who taught a class on the Caribbean when I was an undergraduate at NYU, and she was very, very interested in the way that Caribbean culture was an indigenous product, but unlike mainland Latin America, built largely on the graves of indigenous people um, and composed of slaves and masters, the descendants of slaves and masters, which was intensely creative and intensely problematic at the same time. So I think when I went to Belize to do Mayan archaeology, it was not hard for me to make the transition to thinking about um, Belize as a multicultural place where creolization was such an obvious thing going on all around us at the same time that it was really a kind of um, a, a watershed moment in the way I was thinking about anthropology um, as a way of understanding cultural change without having it driven by some kind of pressure or some kind of fear or some kind of manipulation by elites, but instead to understand history as, like, as Marx did, as a product of people's everyday practice and a kind of encounter between groups of people and those who own property. And that's definitely describes the history of Belize, where even today more than 90% of the freehold land is owned by foreigners, um, which, when you reflect on it, would drive North Americans totally crazy to live in a land that was owned by people from another country. Like Danny and Sid Mintz, um, I have this background in the Caribbean, but also an intense interest in what people do on a daily basis and how people live their lives. And although Danny has never worked explicitly on food, he's worked a lot on clothing and personal possessions. And for me, food is in exactly that same category of everyday acts that involve very strong forces that are, in a sense, abstract and virtual.
So, in terms of the everyday, was that a category that you feel like developed out of your research itself, or was something that you were encountering in kind of a more theoretical context and then applying to your field site?
I think both.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the time, my main object of study was households. And that was because I was unconvinced by the kinship analysis that I was force fed in graduate school. And it seemed to me that in anthropology, we needed a way of talking about daily life and the operation of intimate groups of people that didn't start out with abstract categories, but which kind of built empirically from the ground up. And it also seemed to me that um, when I first read Bourdieu, Outline of a Theory of Practice, it kind of inspired um, me to think about the way that in a household you had both structure and agency, and you had people not slavishly following the rules, which is kind of the way I was taught kinship worked, but people who were engaged in negotiation and improvisation and coping in a way that both incorporated um, altruism and selfishness, that kind of presented people with the dilemmas of being human every day rather than an encounter with a large scale construct like kinship system, for example. So for me, discovering Bourdieu in the early 80s was a way of connecting what I was doing and seeing in Belize, which was very rapid change in households and household formation, with theory. And in particular, a theory that broke out of a structuralist mode and became concerned with um, praxis and everyday action. So food is an instantly recognizable way of connecting your own experience with other people's experience, which is, after all, kind of the fundamental goal of cultural anthropology.
That's right. Let me just pick up one or two things from that period you're talking about in the 1980s. I mean, you thought of yourself maybe at first as an economic anthropologist.
Hmm. Actually, what happened was the only job I could get out of graduate school was teaching archaeology as a temporary visiting nobody at UC Santa Cruz. And while I was there, I met really interesting people, um, and it was the first energy crisis. Actually, no, the second energy crisis. And I got involved in doing research on household energy use in California. So I became more and more interested in doing applied work. And as it became clear I did not have an academic future at UC Santa Cruz, I left academia for a very attractive situation living in Belize and working for the Agency for International Development, which was just setting up an office in the U.S. Embassy there and it rapidly expanded into a full-scale mission, a full-scale program. So I was initially just serving as a consultant, but eventually they brought me on as a personal services contractor. And the opportunity to live in Belize was really attractive. And as part of a roads and bridges project I worked on, I got to visit every community in the country and to interview the leaders and and economic actors in every community in the country. But when an academic opportunity came up for me to finally get a tenure track position at New Mexico State, the goal was really to develop a program in applied cultural anthropology. And having taken a course in economic anthropology as a graduate student, it had always been on my mind, but it wasn't until Hal Schneider here at Indiana University died unexpectedly while getting minor surgery in the Bloomington Hospital that the department suddenly found itself needing an economic anthropologist. And I was willing to kind of pop up and say, yes, I'm an economic anthropologist. And by then I had really been interacting a lot with the Society for Economic Anthropology that proved to be a really important intellectual community for me. So I kind of slid into being an economic anthropologist initially as a kind of opportunistic move. But then I found that I was actually in a really good place to do the kinds of work I wanted to do anyway. And it's always kind of hard to move into a position that had been occupied by somebody as important and kind of central to the subdiscipline as Hal Schneider was. But I think I eventually kind of developed my own approach to economic anthropology. I have to say, teaching the course of teaching courses on economic anthropology, my students really educated me, and I learned a tremendous amount from teaching a new subject and trying out ideas with graduate students who were kind of bright and challenging and willing to ask tough questions, which kind of led me to get a lot more involved in graduate education and working with graduate students, which has been tremendously rewarding. I've done a lot of publishing with my graduate students, and I've done joint research projects and just finished a book with one of my recent PhD students.
So this is the same period that postmodernism developed in anthropology, and looking 30 years on, there are a lot of anthropologists who, like Jim Carrier, who blame postmodernism for neoliberalism. I wonder if you feel like you had a relationship to postmodernism, or what your feelings about it were at the time and looking back now.
You know, Jim Clifford was at UC Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program while I was there. And, so I was aware there was a lot of energy and a lot of interest in his work. But having been trained as an ecological anthropologist, although not, at a kind of Marvin Harris extreme, I think I was initially very skeptical, like a lot of people. But as I started to see the divisive nature of this kind of counter reaction and the science wars that really got underway in the 80s, um, it became very personal because our own department here was kind of being torn in half. And I found myself really kind of not comfortable on either half in the sense that to me, the important connections in anthropology have always been between uh, culture, ideology, symbolism, and critical theory, and the kind of practical, everyday economic realities of living in an interconnected world built on colonialism. Um, and having done field work in a colony, a British colony, and it was still called British Honduras when I started working there, I was intensely aware of the way that the groups of people that I was working with were, in a very fundamental way, a creation of colonialism. And the British had a very strong policy in Belize of keeping the ethnic groups separate and each one with its own stereotypical occupation. Um, so if you're living with the practice and eventually the vestiges of colonialism, I don't see how you can avoid thinking about both power and ideology, and at the same time, kind of basic economic realities of life and the practice of making a living. Um, so I tried to identify, and here I think I was influenced partially by Michael Hertzfeld, who was department chair when I was hired, um, thinking about a kind of militant middle ground that resisted polarizing debate. You know, is it a humanity? Is it a science? And to kind of try to bring people together in the middle rather than divide in two, which I think was like a horrible tactical move just in terms of university politics. The larger your department, the more powerful you are in a very fundamental way. And cutting yourself in half is like uh, not a very good tactic, especially at a time when the university was very skeptical of social sciences and looking for opportunities to cut the budget, and willing to let disciplines fight it out for resources instead of finding a way to allocate them. Um, so I think fortunately we didn't divide because there was a constituency for keeping things in the middle and keeping an energetic but not hostile conversation going. The problem is, you know, that if you're in the center, you can be attacked by both extremes. And this kills a lot of political movements, like ones I had been involved in as a high school student and an undergraduate in the Vietnam era, and being subject to the draft and things like that. So, yeah, it was a fraught moment. Um, and, um, and I think also I, at the time, also a difficult moment to speak with authority based partially on white male privilege, which was still, I mean, the dominant mode in anthropology in the 80s and 90s. And it wasn't really that long ago that things in the discipline started to change in a pretty dramatic way. But I don't think we're still, I think we still have a lot of work to do on that particular issue.
Right, and as far as your point about the middle, I mean, in terms of food, it's hard to imagine that anyone ever thought food wasn't both good to think and good to eat.
Yeah. And also, it connects what your body with all these abstract things like culture and power. Um, and, you just can't avoid thinking about those things when you sit down at the table to eat with other people. Um, and I think in the American mode of dealing with that is to either concentrate on the individual as a choice-making entity or the state as a policy-making entity, and to kind of forget about all the stuff in between, which is where I think anthropology is most powerful. Um, so, I think the opening of food as a topic in academia is a kind of wedge that allows anthropologists to take a really central place in a, an issue of global importance at this point. From fairly early on, um, that interest in energy research kind of resurfaced as global climate change started to become an overriding issue. Um, because once again, we're connecting consumption and daily life with the future of the planet. And you can't ask for a more important issue where anthropology is absolutely crucial to understanding how daily life is connected to CO2 emissions, among other things, and the politics of climate change. So my interest in consumption kind of combined with an awareness of sustainability and global issues for me in the 90s. And it was a time when I started to get a sense that consumption was more than a theoretical issue for anthropologists or a kind of development issue for ex-colonial countries. And it made me think a lot more about how our own consumer culture works and how it produces unhealthy bodies, and how it personalizes those things and ignores culture and power. Um, so I think anthropologists have the just exactly the right toolkit and the theoretical um, tools as well to step into a really important place in shaping the future of life on the planet. I can't think of anything more important.
One other question, kind of going back in time, is archaeology. You moved out of archaeology, and yet you're married to an archaeologist. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on your ongoing relationship to archaeology.
Yeah. Well, frankly, I still love the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the materiality of ancient Mayan culture is just to me endlessly interesting. Um, and Anne and I have had just tremendously productive discussions about heritage and tradition and self-knowledge, which articulates very closely with the kinds of interests that I have in cultural anthropology. And frankly, I've always kind of thought of archaeology as just the cultural anthropology of dead people. And that even the boundary between living people and dead people can be pretty ambiguous because we got a lot of people walking around who are actually dead, and we have a lot of people in the ground who are actually very much alive in an important sense. So, you know, Anne and I invented this term, the metabolically stable, as being, the majority of human beings, meaning they're dead. And that us metabolically unstable people are the anomaly, and that we demand special attention, sometimes undeserved. Um, so, you know, I love archaeology, but it frustrates me endlessly because there's not enough data to really understand what was going on at crucial times in the human past. Um, and so people fill in with their assumptions. And that has made archaeology into even more of a kind of projection of our own interests. Um, and in the early 80s, kind of my swan song in archaeology was publishing a paper that pointed out the close relationship between what was happening in American politics and what was happening in the way American anthropologists and archaeologists thought about the ancient Maya. And it upset a number of people. But I think for me, it kind of opened a conversation about how we construct the past. And I have to say, teaching with Diane Gifford Gonzalez at UC Santa Cruz in the early 80s, I mean, she is a wonderful archaeologist, but also a really interesting thinker and an original uh, person who thinks anthropologically. And we co-taught a course which included reading Clan of the Cave Bear and Tarzan, and really got me understanding more about how the past and the present are, and the imaginary are related to, are closely interrelated with one another. So, moving from that to Anne's conversation about development and heritage and how we objectify heritage and manage heritage has been really easy for me to connect with my own interests in some really fundamental ways. And actually, in the early 90s, working with one of my graduate students, Julie Hollowell, we surveyed archaeologists to find out what they were thinking about their ethical practice and how they related to the communities that they were working in. Because, Anne and I were both working in the same community in Belize. And so we had an opportunity to see how community engagement in archaeology had tremendous potential, but also a lot of possible pitfalls. Um, and she's been really creatively building that as a topic within archaeology in a really, I think, important way, especially given the kind of contentious nature of the past and the, visible activities by groups like ISIS to erase the past and to destroy it.
I see, like in the New Yorker magazine, discussions of the these periods 30, 40,000 years ago and what they mean for our present, and anthropologists who are looking for radical alternatives picking up on this kind of ancient stuff in different ways. So it really seems like it's just like, as you said, in this earlier period, archaeology was maybe reflecting this more conservative politics.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and remember, we were drinking or tasting archaic beer last night, which again kind of puts food into the conversation. And I just love the way that archaeologists have transformed in the last 15 or 20 years from talking about diet to talking about cooking and food and cuisine, and seeing pots as more than kind of diagnostic artifacts, and recognizing that the pots had something in them and that the contents were often a lot more important than the pot, um, which is just, I think, a tremendous leap forward in the way that we think about the past. It also gives us a chance to connect our own bodily experience with prospective pasts. Um, so, if anything, the anthropology of food um, also opens up conversations between bioanthropologists, cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and even linguists.
That's right.
Um, if you look at a lot of those Proto-Indo-European words, a tremendous number of them have to do with food, dividing the world into edible and inedible, and things like that.
That beer was delicious, by the way. It was made by your graduate student
Yes.
using einkorn wheat, I
Yeah.
believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Aaron Ellis has really kind of shown how craft beer making is anthropologically a lot more interesting than you would think. Um, Partially because it connects with internet and new media, but also because it connects ways of learning culture, and things that you're interested in, like cooking as a kind of praxis that brings together culture and social organization and the economy and ideas about the past and about what makes us human.
Coming up to the present, you're, you've just published a book on fish, and I know you're an avid fisherman.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? The book and the fishing, if you like.
Well, it's funny that I have been an avid fisher person my whole life, and I've always kind of resisted turning my hobby into my profession or vice versa. Um, but um, I think tenure and professorship has given me the opportunity to mix those things in a much less threatening way. And, if I said, yeah, I'm going to go study fishing guides and go trout fishing in the Rocky Mountains, people would be very skeptical. As in fact, they were skeptical about the anthropology of food not very long ago. Well, the reason I didn't do field work in Hawaii, great fishing, good diving, good snorkeling, but I think especially in American anthropology, we treat anything fun with great suspicion. Fishing for me is largely about connecting with people and nature. But interestingly, you know, everywhere I've ever fished, there's been some fish that's evil that needs to be killed and thrown back in the water. And if that isn't the operation of culture on food, I don't know a better example, because you're actually catching potential food and not eating it and rejecting it, even though it's completely edible. Um, so um, I've gotten much more interested in the way that taste and food connects with, again, with kind of macro issues like the uh, death of the oceans through overfishing and plastic pollution and other kinds of things. And so, writing a book on seafood with my old graduate student Shingo Hamada has given us the opportunity to connect body and globalization, um, mostly as a teaching exercise and a way for students to see how anthropology makes that connection. And so it was also a tremendous amount of fun working with Shingo. So it I have to admit it has kind of diminished my pleasure in fishing because I learned a lot about fish as conscious beings. not so much echinoderms and crustaceans. You know, I'm still okay with the oysters and lobster, but you know, it turns out fish are pretty intelligent and feel pain, and that's made me kind of reevaluate fishing as a as an entertainment, and to it's also become over commercialized, and Americans can turn anything into a sport. So actually, in the last chapter, I wrote about collegiate fishing because there are 120 collegiate bass fishing teams in the NCAA, including IU, which doesn't publicize the fact that they subsidize bass fishing for undergraduates. But they do. They have a team boat and team shirts, and they get sponsorship by from boat manufacturers and fishing gear producers. So, you know, it fishing is only partially about eating and producing food. It's also mass mediated. Um, and now, you know, fishing blogs and the fishing videos and all of that stuff has kind of exploded on the internet.
I don't suppose you wrote about the wrestling the giant catfish that they do.
Actually, I did. There is a little bit about noodling in there um, because it's such a macho thing, you know, so clearly about gender, you know, and giant fishing rods and huge fish and all of that kind of sports discourse that but also where I've been living and working in Belize for the last 20 years, fishing has gone from a subsistence activity to a cash crop um, to a tourist attraction. And there are still people fishing for subsistence, and there are still people fishing for the market. But now the value of fish as a source of entertainment for ecotourists and fishing tourists is becoming dominant. So the kind of fun, commercial fun of fishing has become more and more part of the local economy. So the guys I go fishing with used to be commercial fishermen in most cases, and are still trying to project that identity as an essential part of masculinity, among other things.
So, in retirement, you've also, I noticed, been writing a column for Anthropology News. Has that been a good opportunity to get things off your chest? Or?
Well, you know, there is a dark side, um, and I think in my career, I've probably seen every form of academic misconduct. Um, and I've actually been victim of some of those forms of misconduct. Um, and and there are still many things about anthropology as the way it's institutionalized in the United States that I find really upsetting and which I think really require rethinking. And sometimes I have two minds. You know, sometimes I look at my colleagues and I'm just tremendously encouraged by the way they move along with the culture and the way that their understanding has progressed in a real tangible sense during my time as an anthropologist. But there's other things I look at and I just despair. You know, we still expect students to come from other countries to study here and then go back and study their own culture. Whereas, you know, us white Americans can go and study any culture we want. And in fact, if we go and study our own culture, we pay a price because we haven't been there and, you know, done the exotic. So I think Laura Nader, like back in the 70s, was really involved in trying to bring foreign anthropologists to study the United States. And we need a lot more of that. Um, we should be giving, dissertation support to foreign students to come and study us after 100 years of supporting us to go and study them. And as long as that kind of colonial imbalance persists, we're going to be alienated in some very important ways. So, yeah, that's just like one of the things that bothers me. And I love, that being a grumpy optimist gives me the opportunity both to think about those great positive parts of being an anthropologist, but also to do the critique and recognize that it's a group enterprise that needs to be under critique all the time and to take that critique seriously.
What you said both in this just now and a minute ago reminds me of Sherry Ortner's term dark anthropology.
Yeah.
And it seems like food has the potential to be really dark,
Yes.
but also incredibly joyful.
Yes, absolutely. And, yesterday you were talking about commensality, and what I was thinking about was my parents' dinner table and how cruel it was often, and how it promoted sibling rivalry, and how, um, this eat all the food on your plate. When you actually talk to people about the actuality of their own family dinners, you hear all kinds of horrible stuff. Yet the idea of the family dinner remains a cherished um, kind of piece of knowledge, and it goes to exactly what you were just saying, that the potential for solidarity, building solidarity through commensality, is paralleled by the power um, of the dinner table to be an exercise of authority and to be a scene for various kinds of conflict. So I don't always or often cite Napoleon Chagnon, but his work on the feast, which is potentially a way of bringing people from another village into the fold and becoming one with them. But it can also turn into an axe fight um, very quickly. And I think we all are intimately aware of that potential for things to kind of fall apart and become catastrophic. And I value the optimistic anthropology of thinking about the transformative potential of expanding that circle of commensality and using it as a way of motivating change. Um, but I've written about um, kind of the power of um, loving the uh, food of other people. But you can see how it can also be an exercise of power. You know, so we can eat French food and it doesn't threaten our identity, but being French, being seeing American food popping up everywhere is actually threatening. And I don't think that's false consciousness. I think it really is threatening in a fundamental way. So a lot just depends on who's got the power um, to to exercise control over what you eat.
I was reading last week Bakhtin's Rabelais and His World, where he's talking about carnival and feasting and all of that, and he has a line where, and he's talking about how eating is a kind of victory where we've struggled with nature and won, as he says, and so he says that eating can never be a sad event. It's always happy. And I posted that line on Facebook, and I had so many of my friends respond with pictures of scenes from The Godfather or from Game of Thrones, The Red Wedding, or all of these pictures of very dark meals. I think that, yeah.
I remember giving a talk about bad family meals and bad family dinners and going on the web to look for some images and not finding any. You know, there were just there were like a couple of pictures of little kids playing with their food, but there were lots of pictures of animal families, like cats sitting around a table fighting with each other over the food, and dogs sitting around the table, or even squirrels sitting around the table. So, in some way, it's possible to think about animals having problems eating together. But the ideology of the family dinner and the kind of transformative potential of eating at home, the US government spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year promoting family dinners as the anti-drug. Um, and, without ever pausing to think that people working three jobs or two jobs to try to support a family don't really have time to cook a good, healthy family meal where everybody's going to get together and talk seriously about the issues of the day.
Yeah, I think I heard a study a couple of years ago that was concerned with the decline of family meals and that
They've always been in decline.
that's right and that the people were not eating around the table, and one research team concluded, well, the problem is that they don't have a table, so we should buy people tables so that they can not eat in front of the TV, but eat it in this idealized middle class setting.
Yeah, and now there's a moral panic about people looking at their cell phones while they're eating instead of looking at each other. Um, and I have to say, when I go in a restaurant and I see, like a whole family sitting around the table looking at their iPhones, it's hard not to jump to the conclusion that they're alienated from each other. But, what are they doing on their cell phones? It might be a very social thing. And it just might be an expanded sphere of commensality instead of one that's disappearing. Um, but, you know, the family has been declining ever since humanity became self-conscious. Um, and so I'm always suspicious of that kind of discourse. But there really are things that are declining in the world today and that are really disturbing. Um, and focusing on poor people's ability to have a family meal seems to me to be pretty trivial compared with other kinds of issues that we face, like the effect of that meal on climate change, for example. Um, or right now, we're having a moral panic about food waste. And I know that if I kind of went out in public and said, food waste, not an issue, that people would immediately jump on me. Um, but frankly, the way that we're talking about food waste, it's just like your parents saying, eat your peas. There are children starving in India. Um, there's really no logical connection between what you throw away from your plate and what's actually starving people in India, which happens to be neoliberal reforms of the agricultural sector. Um, so this is just another way that we push social and political problems onto individuals and make it their responsibility. Like, if you just ate the ends of your cucumbers and the skins of your onions, this would solve world hunger, which is just total bullshit.
Well, this has been really fascinating. I guess I have one more question, which is kind of looking toward the future. Um, what do you feel like? Where would you feel like you'd like to see food anthropology going? Are there for you um, either theoretical or concrete issues um, that we need to explore much more? If you had a team of graduate students that you could, I know you don't like to tell your graduate students what to do, but like in a fantasy world, if you could send out a team of graduate students, what would be the most pressing issues to you at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I have a kind of mercurial approach to problems, which is that I often kind of jump from one to the other pretty quickly. But right now, I think the issue of taste and why some things are good to eat and others aren't is really um, of central importance, both because of um, disordered forms of eating um, that are bad for our own health, um, and which I am intimately aware of because of my own health problems related to food. But it's also an issue of sovereignty and security that's relevant to local and national governments. And it's also an issue of global environmental importance. So we have species going extinct because their swim bladders have like a unique shape that makes them extremely valuable. And people willing to pay like thousands of dollars for the lips of a particular kind of tropical fish. Um, and, that's the most dramatic. Um, but, think about the demand for flaky white fish, and the way that that's driven the extinction of Atlantic cod. And now we're doing the same thing with Pacific uh, pollock. Basically, people don't recognize the power of free stuff. And basically, we treat nature as if it was um, a free supermarket. And right now, we're kind of looting the bottom shelves because the middle shelves are all empty. Um, so, there's some self-interest here in that I'd like the next generation to be able to eat seafood. Um, but finding out, and this requires that we work with people in other disciplines. So if I could put together such a team, it would include some geographers and some kind of people who work in nutrition and food science. Um, and I want to talk with the flavor scientists who are themselves kind of out there manipulating the recipe for Doritos to make them into a kind of eternally attractive food. Um, and everywhere you go in the world right now, Pringles cans are not far behind. And, what is it that makes the Pringle translate so easily and become a kind of instant junk food everywhere you go? So, we also need to learn a lot more about how things are sold if we want to be effective in unselling things and making a path towards a more sustainable consumer culture. So, I belong to a group that does sustainable consumption research and has regular conferences. And I'm tired of being the only anthropologist in the room. We need to have more people engaging with those kinds of issues and building a community of practice in anthropology that allows us to study consumer culture in a very intimate way without becoming an outcast because you're doing something, you know, for money. So I'm very proud of my graduate students who have gotten jobs in business schools lately, teaching the anthropology of consumption to people who are the architects of future consumer society. Yeah.
Right. Well, that seems like a great place to stop. But this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I'm so glad that we got it together. And thanks so much, Rick.
Thank you for setting it up and giving me a platform for my opinions.